Ready to go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Loop and Learn's T1D speaker series. We are back after a nice summer off, and we're opening up with a bang. Today we have Dr. Laura Nally, who is with Yale University School of Medicine. She's a pediatric endocrinologist. She's a type 1 diabetic, and she is also a looper. Like, it's a trifecta. And we're just very, very fortunate to have her here with us today. We're all going to learn. So let me go to our usual disclaimer that the Loop app is a do-it-yourself closed loop algorithm. The presentation is provided to assist you in making your own decisions in consultation with your healthcare professionals regarding your own diabetes self-management. You take full responsibility for building and running this system, and you do so at your own risk. Please remember that the Loop app is not FDA approved for therapy. So let's talk about what we're doing over at Loop and Learn. We have a pretty extraordinary website that actually just started in late November. It is a year ago, and it is so robust that you should be able to find pretty much anything you need to on there. That we have menus that work, hot tips, hot topics, announcements, and that's where you can also sign up for the newsletter, which goes out at this time of year about once a week, and it's the critical stuff that you actually need to know to run your loop and be safe. So if you haven't signed up for it, you'll get the emails. We test it pretty extensively before it goes out, and it's absolutely worth it. This will be in the presentation, so if you don't catch the address here, you can pick it up on the video later on. And a couple of events coming up because this week we're kind of loaded with really cool events, but it's a lot for 1 week. Wednesday night, we're doing an open mic night. This is to help you all with updating your system in anticipation of installing the new iOS. It's a lot of confusion. A lot of people are not quite sure what to do. So on Wednesday, the 29th of September, from 4 to 6 p.m. Pacific time, and you can figure out what time that is where you are, but it starts at 4 p.m. in Pacific time. There'll be a Zoom link available on our Facebook group. If you've been waiting to update to iOS, we suggest you wait until the small little updates come through, 15.1 or 15.2, just so you don't run into bugs, but it's a good idea. If you can't wait, we can help you if you get into some trouble. So show up, we'll tell you what to do. The announcement will go out on Facebook. It's already written. It will go out as soon as this event is over. So you'll see what we're doing. It's Wednesday night. You don't have to do anything other than get ready to update everything and listen and learn. Also this week, Roche Diabetes and Diaboloop have agreed to come and do a presentation for Loop and Learn. They set the time, so I apologize for the time change. It's 9:30 a.m. That's in the morning, Pacific time. They are broadcasting from Europe, and this is during the EASD, is that the European Diabetes Conferences, and they are controlling the Zoom, so this will not be recorded. So you either have to tell your boss you need a 1 hour time slot break, or get up early, or get up later, or have this at lunchtime. This should be really interesting. We have the CEO, we have the international business leader from Roche, we have a professor of diabetology, and we have some users of their DIY system. It would be great to know what they do. You do need to sign up, and that is also on the Facebook announcement, so you'll see that. And then next Sunday is my favorite, is Elliot Botvinnik. He's a PhD researcher at UC Irvine, University of California, Irvine. And he and Greg Weiss, who's the head of the chemistry department, have developed a sensor called iGlobe. They're in the process of it. They got a $3.5 million grant from the Helmsley Trust that measures insulin, lactate, oxygen, and beta hydroxybutyrate. First try. And it's a strip, and it's extraordinary what they're working on, and it utilizes light and chemistry. He's entertaining. He's wonderful. I hope you can tune in next Sunday afternoon, 5 p.m. Pacific time. Not for our events. We're doing things a little different today. Since it is a DIY community, that means we all kind of work together. I've invited 2 of our members to join us in the Q&A, so who have really specific experience in raising children and also looping during pregnancy. So Annette Vale, I think I pronounced it right. If not, she'll correct me, is an RN diabetes educator. She's a type 1 for 21 years, used open APS before she became a looper in 2017. She's got 3 kids. She looped during her last pregnancy and was shocked by the difference it made in her management. She most recently worked with Integrated Diabetes Services. That's Gary Shiner's group. Now she's doing insulin pump trainings, and her comment is, "I'm grateful for the amazing people and life lessons diabetes has brought into my life." That's the positive spin. Kate, or Kathleen Reardon, is a mom, a sister, and a daughter to T1D warriors.
Joanne, you're muted.
Okay. Did that just start?
Yeah, it's only been for the last 15 seconds or so.
Okay.
It started when you got the first line of Kathleen Reardon out,
Okay.
and then you
All
got
right.
muted.
That's when I make a mistake anyway. I'll cut it out. She has a daughter who's age 7. She was diagnosed 2.5 years ago. She was diagnosed at age 7. I still made the mistake and started looping pretty quickly. She's a health law attorney, education technology consultant, and a single mom. Her hands are full. And favorite things about Loop, it helps her remotely monitor her daughter so she can spend hours at dance and tennis, and the incredible friends she's found in the Loop community. We are kind of an amazing community. So now to the main event. So excited. Dr. Laura Nally, MD, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 6 in 1990. She trained to become a pediatric endocrinologist at Stanford University, where she began looping in 2018. While at Stanford, she spent 8 days hiking Mount Whitney, that's 14,505 feet, the tallest peak in the contiguous US, with 9 teens and 2 adults with T1D. And went on to write the first Wilderness Medical Society clinical practice guidelines for diabetes management. That is so cool. If you have questions on that, put them in chat. We'll bring them up later on in the Q&A. She currently works at Yale University as an assistant professor and receives funding from the National Institutes of Health to study metabolism changes that occur on very low carbohydrate diets in youth with T1D. She also published the first case report of looping in pregnancy, and the PDF is available. It's in our Facebook group, and if you need it, send me an email. I'll send it to you. She spends her free time advocating to improve access and affordability of diabetes medications and supplies, serving as a legislative lead for the Connecticut Insulin for All Chapter of T1 International. So I'm going to take this off. I think I can end the share, and I am going to turn this over to Dr. Nally. Oh my gosh, thank you for taking your time on Sunday night, and you're set to go. Thank you. And everybody else, you can make sure you stay muted and you can turn off your cameras. And thank you.
Hi, okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for that great introduction. So I'm a pediatric endocrinologist, and so I basically see children with diabetes, and I have several loopers in our clinical practice as well. I've seen some in fellowship training as well. And so today we're going to be talking a little bit about these do-it-yourself artificial pancreas systems. So just as my disclosures, I've received free Dexcom supplies in support of investigator-initiated research. Of course, I've used a do-it-yourself hybrid closed loop system since March of 2018. This is a picture of me with Rehan Lal, if you know him. He's a physician out at Stanford still. who got me started on Loop back in the day. And we'll be discussing Loop, which has not been FDA approved. Thank you for all of those disclosures that you listed before. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is that it is very important to discuss dose adjustments with your diabetes provider before making them, because there are some little tweaks that we may know about, safety concerns and things like that, as far as how high can the settings go, how can you change some of the settings. So I do think it's important to at least consult with your provider when making dose adjustments. So for today, I want to talk a little bit about how do-it-yourself diabetes management started, and then we'll go through the basics of the Loop system, adjusting doses, safety considerations, and then I'll take questions from the group. And of course, at any time, if please just feel free to go ahead and interrupt me. There's a few pauses in between. So if there is a question that you guys can go ahead and let me know. Okay. So I also want to say, if you're here, you're automatically doing an amazing job, because I feel like we don't tell parents enough, but it is so hard to take care of diabetes for a child, and especially super young ones that are toddlers. And I just want to say that the fact that you're here, the fact that you're interested and you're trying to learn to help your child's health, you're doing an amazing job, and your child is in excellent hands. Okay. I don't feel like we tell you enough. So basically, how did this all start? And it started with this, with a vision: we are not waiting. So it was this phrase was first coined at the Diabetes Mind D-Data Exchange gathering at Stanford University in November of 2013. This is where Lane Desborough, who is the former chief engineer at Medtronic and current chief engineer at Bigfoot Biomedical, and Howard Look, who's currently the CEO of Tidepool, tackled the lack of standardization and interoperability of health data. And basically what they wanted from this was to make the diabetes data more accessible, intuitive, and actionable. And they wanted to be able to help their children achieve fewer lows and have a better A1c. They discussed many things that they were waiting for. The data was all disconnected. Endocrinologists were asking for people to tell them their blood sugars and insulin doses and carbohydrate content, which is very hard to do and remember and keep track of. Device manufacturers weren't innovating quickly enough. And they just wanted peace of mind. So there's a lot of things that were prompting this sort of movement. And it started with Night Scout, or the CGM in the cloud, that allowed for do-it-yourself remote monitoring. So basically what this was, Night Scout, which we still use today, is an open source do-it-yourself project that allowed for real-time access to CGM data before we had real-time access. And it was through a personal website, smartwatch, or you could use app widgets. And the co-founders of this were Lane Desborough and John Kostick in August of 2013. And basically what they discussed they discussed their personal risks of potentially getting sued or fired because they were creating their own code and open sourcing it because of their positions at their jobs. But they thought that it was unfair for other families not to benefit from this transformative technology, and decided that the community benefits outweighed their personal risks. So the original do-it-yourself, original do-it-yourself device really included a smartphone that could access the internet and view your CGM data. Setup costs were about $100, and then you would also have cell and data packages. But these were some of the initial devices that we had. And then the next step was putting these pieces together with the technology that was available. So basically we had to reverse engineer the insulin pump. Ben West was a San Francisco-based software engineer diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the end of college. He had hackathons with his family to figure out how to communicate with the pump and execute commands. And eventually, through this collaboration, they were able to execute temporary basal rates remotely. And what he said was he was using a portable insulin pump that he had to write down all the data from every day and call and read it to the clinic at night. And his device was preventing him from sleeping. So he got upset and he wanted to figure out what he could do about it. So he called Medtronic to see if they could provide him with the information he needed to talk to the pump, but they denied his request. So he was able to do it himself, which is pretty impressive. At the same time, Dana Lewis was having issues sleeping through her CGM alarms. So she and her boyfriend at the time, and now husband, and software engineer Scott Liebrand tried to tackle this issue. And she said her concerns were that she would worry that when she went to sleep at night, she'd have a low blood sugar, not hear the alarm, and not wake up in the morning. And she thought it would be hours or potentially like days before somebody would come check on her and try and see what's going on. So in November 2013, she actually saw a tweet about how someone had managed to get his son's data through the CGM in real time transferred to him through the internet, and he was willing to share his code. And that's basically how these different groups came together, where Night Scout met Dana Lewis. And so Ben West met Scott Liebrand and Dana Lewis in 2014 and showed them how he was able to create temporary basal rates on the pump. This is what it looks like when they were in their planning modes. They spent 3 months working on it, and what they put together ended up being open APS. And then by December of 2014, the do-it-yourself loop had been closed. So this is what the original do-it-yourself artificial pancreas system looked like. It included a Raspberry Pi, your CareLink, your insulin pump, of course, a battery to keep everything going, and then your Dexcom continuous glucose monitor with an early prototype. But obviously this setup was pretty bulky, had lots of pieces to keep track of, and contained a lot of wires that could be easily disconnected. However, I do want to point out that Dana Lewis was able to run a marathon with this system, which is pretty impressive. So next came Loop. And so Nate Rackleft used Python code to automate his insulin needs to manage type 1 diabetes in July of 2015. And Pete Schwam used his skills to clone the CareLink radio frequency device that could be bridged to the Bluetooth low energy interface that could communicate with an iPhone, and created the Riley link. And basically their goals at the time were to reduce the time and cognitive load spent on diabetes, create a user interface that was easy to understand, and then facilitate connectivity with this compact Riley link. Of course, now we also have the orange link, which is fantastic. And so after they did their testing, Loop was released in October of 2016. Oh, Dana just ran an ultra marathon this weekend. That is excellent. Okay. So as many of you already know, the Riley link translates that radio frequency communication to and from a Medtronic pump. Now it can also communicate with the Omnipod into Bluetooth low energy that allows it to communicate with the iPhone app. Okay, so that is just a little review of the history of Loop, because I think it's really important to give credit to a lot of the original folks who were in the business making this. Although I want to also give credit to the amazing people who are currently here today, who are also helping everyone continue to use Loop and make it even better. So first I want to talk a little bit about insulin pump basics. So with the insulin pump, we're trying to mimic normal physiology, okay? And so your basal insulin is going to be your background insulin that keeps your blood sugar stable when you're not eating, okay? And then insulin pumps give really small amounts of rapid-acting insulin every few minutes that sort of mimic what your pancreas would be doing in the background if it were doing its job. And then the bolus insulin is the amount of insulin you're giving at a meal or to correct a high blood sugar. So, if you eat 3 meals a day, you might have 3 different boluses, the breakfast, lunch, and dinner bolus. And the gray in the background is what your pancreas actually does. So if you look at that, when you eat a meal, your insulin level actually spikes up very quickly, but then also drops very quickly too. And it's to help you prevent that postprandial spike. Now, the insulins that we have today, unfortunately, aren't able to make that spike exactly like the pancreas does, but we're able to get around that in a lot of different ways. Basal rates also change periodically throughout the day and can change in response to a meal, which is why looping can be really, really helpful. So the closed loop system is basically when you create this feedback loop between the continuous glucose monitor That information, the glucose values are sent to this algorithm that's going to determine how much insulin's been given, and then based on the blood sugar, decide how much additional insulin should be given to help keep the blood sugars in this like target range, basically. It includes a lot of information like the carbohydrate intake, your insulin on board, your current CGM readings, your basal rates, what it expects you to need. And then insulin dosing recommendations are executed by the pump. And so basically the fact that this is it's a hybrid closed loop system, that's where the closed loop comes from. It's a hybrid system because we still have to enter carbohydrate information when we're eating meals, because the pump hasn't, insulin action times and the pump can't quite keep up with unannounced meals as we speak, unless you're following a low carb diet. So there's a lot of goals from different societies about what your pre-meal glucose is supposed to be. They say somewhere between 70 and 145. Obviously, the closer you are to like the 70 to 100 range, the better. And then your 2-hour post-meal glucose could be somewhere between 90 and 180. That's considered reasonable. A bedtime glucose of 90 to 150. And then the A1c target that both groups, the International Society of Pediatric and Adolescent Diabetes and the American Diabetes Association, say less than 7%, if you can achieve that without significant hypoglycemia. And I just want to say that targets should always be individualized based on the person. So I am not going to always recommend a target of 7% if I have someone that's having a lot of significant hypoglycemia. We're going to up that target if we can't mitigate the reasons why we're having the hypoglycemia. And then when we're reviewing our continuous glucose monitoring data, there are various different targets for what we're aiming for. So just in the general population, we're looking for more than 70% of time in the target range of 70 to 180. We're looking for less than 5% lows, and specifically less than 1% severe lows that are less than 54 milligrams per deciliter. And then we do want to minimize time spent hyperglycemic, but also note that sometimes hyperglycemia is going to happen. So these are basically the target ranges that we have: less than 5% above 250 and less than 25% above 180. In the pediatric world, especially toddlers and adolescents, I would say things get a little bit trickier. So the actual target time and range during childhood is a little bit closer to 60% for a lot of those groups, but of course it is individualized for each person. I'm not going to specifically raise someone's A1c because it's too low if we're not having hypoglycemia. And I just want to let you guys know that for every 5% increase in this time in the target range is another like 1.2 hours per day that you're spending in that range, which can be really, really beneficial just from a mental health standpoint and also just physiologically. It can really just help you. So I don't want anybody to be discouraged if you're not making like dramatic increases in your time and range, that even just a 5% increase is a big deal that should be celebrated. Diabetes management is frustrating because there are a lot of factors that we do not have control over. So typically when I talk to families, especially pediatric patients, I usually say that there's, like maybe 60 to 70% of the time we can predict what we're going to need. We're going to be able to predict our insulin doses and things are going to work out okay. And then, 30% of the time, we're not going to be able to for a wide variety of reasons. So you can have different insulin absorption times depending on the part of the body that you're using for your insulin infusion. Lipohypertrophy, sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't, but it's that scar tissue that builds up if you're using similar spots for your insulin absorption. With our toddlers, we don't have a lot of places to go necessarily. There's not a lot of real estate with the skin. So it can get kind of tricky, but you don't always see and feel lipohypertrophy. Unfortunately, it could still be there, and it just makes insulin absorption unpredictable. The temperature of your skin. So season changes, all sorts of things can potentially affect insulin doses. If you've ever had your child take a shower, take a warm shower or a warm bath, the temperature of your skin can increase the rate of insulin absorption, and then you might have a low blood sugar afterwards. Or I've also heard of families having their child take a warm bath when their blood sugar is high because they want it to come down, as a way of potentially helping with that. Yeah, interesting that you can't always see it. So that's a good point, because I actually had a patient that I was really struggling trying to figure out what was going on with her blood sugars. And I spoke with someone at the NIH who does a lot of research on lipohypertrophy. And they basically said that like, it is not always visible. Cause I was like, I've checked her skin, and that was a great learning point for me, is that, you know, it may not be visible. Of course, if it is visible, then definitely, like, you know, you feel a bump, stay away from that area. But I do think that rotating, even if you're not noticing those lumpy, bumpy areas, is still important. Oops. Oh, I still want to talk on this page. Okay, there we go. Yeah, so infusion sets, sometimes they're evil and they kink under your skin without you ever knowing it, or they become completely dislodged, right? So those are things that we can be prepared by having an extra set available, but you know, there may be a period of time where we're going to have high blood sugars, and it's going to happen, and it's okay. It will be okay. You just try to be as prepared as you can. Sensor errors are also just, you know, those happen sometimes. And you can also lay on your sensor, and by laying on your sensor and compressing it, you kind of squeeze out the fluid where it's sensing the glucose changes. And so sometimes that can also make us think that there's a low blood sugar when it's really just the area is being compressed. And so that's another thing that can kind of lead us astray. I'm not sure how many folks are using like Fiasp or Lumjev, but I will just share from my personal experience, I do sometimes have bleeding at the infusion site. So everything is fine. I'm 2 days into my site, and all of a sudden my blood sugars are high and I can't get them down, and everything looks normal on the outside. And then when I take off my infusion set, I start bleeding. So unfortunately that has been my personal experience. I don't know what others' experiences have been, but that's always something that could happen, especially with these insulins that are increasing your blood flow to that area. It's a risk. And of course, stress. I wish we had an insulin dosing algorithm for stress, but unfortunately it's a little bit unpredictable. So some stress is healthy stress, some is not. And a lot of times predicting blood sugar changes with that can be very difficult. And so I do try with a lot of my patients who are experiencing a lot of like blood sugar fluctuations related to stress. And we've like narrowed it down and just noticed that, hey, your blood sugars, you know, go up a lot when you're stressed out. Trying to develop some coping mechanisms. So for example, I get stressed out giving presentations like this one today, and I typically give myself insulin before the presentation because I always have my blood sugars go up when I'm speaking in front of an audience. So, and then I also think, just from like a parent perspective, modeling coping mechanisms is really important for our kids. If we see, you know, if a child sees a parent like really, really stressing about diabetes related things, they might not know how to understand that stress. So I think it's a difficult thing to do, but as much as we can model to our children, like, you know, yeah, you know, the blood sugars didn't go like we wanted them to or how we expected, but that's okay. We have a plan and we can move forward from here. I think that is really important. Have I seen Fiasp with low dose of insulin for toddlers? Oh, I have not actually. I have not actually seen that yet because I don't have any toddlers on Fiasp. But that's a good question. Okay. I also wanted to just pause for questions at this time. Any questions about anything that came up?
I think we'll probably hold till the end, and then we'll inundate you with questions. But
oh, goody! Write them down.
I put in a temp rate for stress because anytime I host this, my blood sugar goes up. So I totally understand, and I understand from Western Oregon that when they go on a road trip, they do an increase for the stress of being on the road. So it's stuff we don't know. I just have one real quick question because I don't have little kids, but every time I see pictures of little kids with gigantic pods on them, and their skinny little arms or skinny little legs, and then I complain that I'm running out of geography. How How do you do that? The pods are not lightweight. They're not small. How are they able to rotate sites enough on those tiny little bodies?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, the buttocks is a great area where you can spread out on quite a bit. And I think, you don't have to spread out a lot. So a lot of times when we're talking to families, it's like, if you can just move over like an inch, like that's usually like a spot that hasn't really been affected by the insulin absorption over the past 3 days. And then over time, those spots heal. So it's not like you always have to find a completely new spot. It's just a matter of trying to find a little bit further away each time until you get back to where you started. Because a lot of times toddlers are very specific about where they want their, like there are places where it's just not going to work, because they're running around playing and stuff. And then, and when you find a spot that works, you really want to just try to keep it there. So we do, they end up doing okay. I mean, these families are just amazing. Honestly, I think most of it is the families getting creative. And I usually just say, if you can just move an inch side to side, up or down, around in a circle, whatever you want to do, and then switch to the other side and move it like an inch around. Usually we do okay.
I find that amazing. And just a little bit about Fiasp and Lyumjev. And I don't know if it affects people who are long-term diabetes folks, but I've tried Fiasp, which worked well for the first 6 months, and it worked well for the first 4 months, and I kept going off, and it would just stop working. And I don't know if there are antibodies that are circulating that from having had history with animal insulin. Don't know what the problem is, but I've tried Lyumjev, and it's an extraordinary insulin. It just burns so much that I would dread every single bolus. I hope that gets fixed, because I would love to be able to be back on that. I didn't know it was being used in kids. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, I think right now, well, some of it's off label sometimes. I forget sometimes. I believe now we're okay with Fiasp in kids, but sometimes we end up using it off label if we're running into an issue. Okay. Again,
We have no problem with off label here.
Obviously, yeah. I mean, like Fiasp never stopped working for me, but like, I think, when I was in fellowship, there were like 10 of us with type 1, and we were all trying it when it first came out. And like for 2 of us, it was like the best thing ever. We stuck with it. And then for 8 people, it was like, it stopped working. And so, we didn't know if that was like an inflammatory response at the site potentially that was causing issues, but it's like, again, individualized, right? So like I've been on it for several years now and it hasn't stopped working. So I'm thankful, but it's not for everyone, right? So. Okay. Okay. So insulin doses. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about like background, or what we learn as like clinicians about how much insulin does your body need a day. This is like a starting point. So even when I'm teaching like our fellows about diabetes, it's like, it ranges. And if something is working for someone, I try not to reinvent the wheel. I just try to make sure that they're safe, so these doses may not be exactly what you need. It's just kind of a range where most people fall. And of course, not everybody falls into this range. So during early childhood, usually total daily doses of insulin, they're based on your body weight, somewhere between 0.4 and 0.8 units per kilogram of body weight per day. So we do a lot of math when we see patients in clinic, and we kind of see how much insulin are they taking. Is that sort of in the range? And if it's like far above or far below, we might ask some more questions to see like, I wonder why that is. But obviously diet plays a huge role in how much the total daily dose of insulin is going to be. During puberty, there's an insulin resistance of puberty. And basically your insulin doses tend to be highest during these years. So you might see 1 to 2 units per kilogram of body weight per day. And that's because it has a lot to do with growth hormone and all the metabolic processes that are going on during that time. Then once puberty is over and you transition to adulthood, your insulin doses go back down. So it might be closer to 0.5 unit to 1 unit per kilogram of body weight per day. If you do low carb diets, it could be much less than that, 0.5 unit per kilogram of body weight. So it really, it can vary a lot. And let's say you eat a lot of carbs all the time, it could be higher than 1 unit per kilogram of body weight. But that's just sort of like going to give us an idea of where are we on the spectrum of using insulin. And then of course, some people are going to be more insulin resistant than others. And, there are lots of other medications we've tried to try and help with that insulin resistance. None of them have really been effective in pediatric patients with type 1 diabetes or really in adults with type 1 diabetes. So we don't have great options, but sometimes, an alternative medication like a GLP-1 inhibitor or metformin may be helpful. So for some people, we do find it can be helpful, but it's just not across the broad range of everybody with diabetes. Oh, this is a good question. How quickly can hypertrophy jumps disappear, regenerate? So when I see patients in clinic, I can see them disappear by the next visit. So like 3-month intervals, I'll see it go away. It could go away faster. It's like that's really dependent on like your body. But I have definitely, if I tell somebody, hey, stop using that area, and then they stop using it and they start using other sites, that area can sometimes look normal again by the next visit. I think like if you're noticing like, you're using the one spot and every time, because I had this issue with my leg, I was using my leg, but man, every time I used my leg, forget it. My blood sugars were always higher than I expected. So once I figured out that trend, I just stopped using my leg and I went back to the other spots that I was using. So it is sort of like trying to figure out, is this the location? Is that playing a role or what else is going on? Okay. So expectations with looping, and we have a lot of we have a lot of loopers on here already. I'm interested. I don't like to overstate expectations because each person may be a little bit different in how well they do. And it kind of depends on what you're willing to do to manage your diabetes and how, can you pre-bolus for a meal? If you can't pre-bolus for a meal, it's going to be very tricky to get rid of those high blood sugars. So, if your settings are pretty well tuned, usually we can get 70 to 80% time in range. But again, you got to take your insulin dose before you eat. If it's going to be like a high carb meal, may require some meal modifications, especially at breakfast time, but usually we can get it in that sort of a range. A lot of times people get greater than 80% time in range with like low carb diets, or just by making your settings a little bit too aggressive, but that, okay, my settings are aggressive, so I'm always going to follow up that meal with a snack an hour and a half later because I have a toddler and I know they love to eat grapes or something like that, so sometimes folks will do that as well. And as long as, it's something that you can reproduce safely, then I think we're usually pretty flexible about what you want to do. Improving your A1c usually means that you may gain some weight. So the lower you go, then the fewer highs you have, and you could potentially have weight gain. But diabetes burden can be significantly reduced. Fewer button pushes to have to give a boluses that can be given from your smartphone or smartwatch, being able to sleep through the night without alarms. I hope others that are looping on here have gained that benefit, because I think that was like the greatest thing that ever happened to me since starting loop, was just being able to sleep at night for a change. So I'm definitely appreciative of that benefit. Okay. And then I had a question. Are most of your patients using looper? I have a mix of patients. So I have a looping clinic that's about a half day per month. And then I actually have many patients on injections still. I have many patients who are not yet using closed loop. So I've got everybody. Like, you could be on injections, you could be on a pump, you could be on a closed loop system, you could be on loop. And then I also have, I have one patient on open APS as well, but there's just a wide variety that we see at our clinics here. Okay. So when we're thinking about all the things, that can affect diabetes, there's a lot. Okay. It's the insulin injection. Have you exercised recently? How fit are you in general? Your brain, are you stressed out? Are you feeling relaxed? Are you calm? Are you exercising? whatever you ate, whether or not you're a couch potato, if there's stress, and then your unique hormonal balance between your pancreas and your liver and your adrenal glands. Those are things that can be like very hard to predict. So basically, so this is kind of like all the things that you're trying to adjust at one time to hit this target, right? And then you throw pediatrics into the mix, and just children can be quite unpredictable. And even if you're getting every little detail correct, you may not be able to quite hit that target because, you know, you have kids, and sometimes kids just start running around and playing and you didn't know, or they fell and they bumped their head and now they're stressed and now we're having some blood sugar issues. So props to you, to all the families out there who are doing this. So just to give you a little bit of background about where I begin when I'm looking at this information is, I usually start with some sort of trend graph. I usually start actually with looking at how much overall time we're spending in range. So you can look at your Dexcom, if you have a Dexcom, if you have, you know, whatever CGM you have that kind of tells you how much time you're spending in range versus low versus high. I look at that first because it kind of gives me an idea of where do I start. So if I see 10% lows, I'm probably going to start there because I'm going to be like, that's an awful lot of low blood sugars. And you know, our goal is that we want like less than around 4% lows, just because we don't want people to have to spend too much time with low blood sugars each day. And then, you know, if it's 50% highs, then I'm probably going to start there and be like, okay, highs look like they're a big issue. We're not having issues with lows. And then even if we do have like 82% time in range, there's still maybe things that we need to tweak. Okay. The very high range is, I feel like most of the time that's something that can be addressed either with timing of insulin doses, the type of foods that you're eating, and just making sure that you're not having site issues or like missing meal boluses. And so that is something that usually we can address to try and get around that. So then next I'll look at like, what are the patterns? So from this graph, we see that this is the orange line is the 50th percentile, or the median of all the blood sugars. Okay. And then the blue is 25 to 75th percentile. So that's where we're spending the majority of our time, is in that blue range. Okay. And then, you know, the 10th and 90th percentile is this upper green dotted line where we're not spending as much of our time, but some of our time is being spent there. Okay. So when I look at this, just in general, you want to look at variability. Are there any like predictable kind of patterns that we can address where we're not having a lot of highs and a lot of lows? If we're having a lot of highs and a lot of lows, then that means that different things are happening every day. And so I'm not sure exactly what to do without talking more to the family and figuring out what's happening there. But in this diagram, I would say these are the 3 time points where I don't see major issues with lows, but I see, okay, we're running above here. Sometimes overnight, we're having a little bit of issue with some higher blood sugars. We're not really running into lows. Here's another time in from like morning until afternoon where we're having some higher blood sugars and not lows. So I'm like, that's another thing that we could potentially address. And then here's the last time point in the evenings. Basically dinner time seems like we're having an issue. So it's kind of like meal times look like they're the time that things are happening. So that might be the areas that I would focus on to try and figure out what's the next step. But generally I start with this graph to kind of give me an idea. Now, again, if in this middle area, the green line we're dropping into the lows, or the blue line we're dropping into the lows, and we're going into the highs, then that's an area where I'm going to want to address, because I just don't know what's happening in that particular time frame. So I'm going to want to talk to folks and find out what's going on. Like maybe half the days we're swimming and half the days we're not. And so then that's why we're seeing the differences in each day, and to sort of piece out what's going on. So I think that's important. Let's see. Looping patients, goodness. I honestly do not even know how many patients I have in general. I do primarily research, so I don't see the volume of patients that most people do, but let me see. I would have to do math. probably somewhere around like 15 to 20, something like that. Just because I'm thinking like 5 patient slots a month and then they repeat every 3 months. Let's see, from the Little Loopers group, consuming carbs in the middle of the night when they have a low. If there is something that they love to eat, I would capitalize on that. And I would try all sorts of different things to see what they like. Like maybe they like icing. Maybe they'll drink juice. I know it can be really hard. Sometimes the glucose gel that you can just kind of get into their cheek and massage it, they can just absorb that without having to like wake up very much. And then if you can just get them to drink some water with it, that might work. But it's a really tricky time. I would say like try to work with them on foods that they really like, as much as you can. And then if you really need to, then that glucose gel, getting it absorbed in the cheek can be really helpful. So those would be my two thoughts there. I'm not sure if you guys ever use like mini dose glucagon, but sometimes the mini dose glucagon can be used. That's kind of like a whole separate talk, but I don't know if your providers have ever recommended that. Let's see. Kids going back to school. Oh, that can be very tricky. Has anyone heard of mini dose glucagon? Yeah, just to let you know, mini dose glucagon is when you give like, the normal glucagon, not Baqsimi, right? Baqsimi is the nasal spray. The regular glucagon that came in the red vial where you mix it up, you could give like a smaller amount of it. We typically did this at diabetes camp when I was in training. And so you could take like, if you have a 10-year-old, you would do 10 units, give 10 units of the mini dose glucagon just with a regular insulin syringe. And then that could help raise their blood sugars back up. Sometimes we've done that with kids if like they really can't eat anything and they're just having lows. And that's an interesting way around it. So it's something to talk to your doctor about, because unfortunately, like the more recent glucagons that they've come up with now are more stable, but back in the day, once you mix the glucagon, it was only good for 24 hours and then you had to toss it. So, but it's something to discuss with your doctor for sure, to see if they're interested in that or willing to provide help with that. Okay. All right. So toddlers with diabetes. I just want to talk a little bit about this. So toddlers have different patterns than we see in other age groups with diabetes. So a lot of times we've just seen this pattern after looking at lots and lots and lots of toddlers, that sometimes between 3 and 6 a.m., they might not need any insulin at all. And I think some people are really hesitant to really set that pump to like 0 or even like a loop system, but you may need to have very low settings in the middle of the night, just because a lot of toddlers they need such small doses of insulin, and sometimes that insulin from before is still active and they're just very sensitive at that time and they just don't need much. Higher basal rates are typically needed in this age group between 9 p.m. and 12 a.m. So if you have noticed, like after 9 p.m., it's not just you. This is like a toddler effect. It's a toddler phenomenon that we're seeing it. So their diurnal rhythm's a little bit different than other age groups. Definitely, they might need less insulin after active days, like day at the beach or snow day. They're running around a lot. You can consider doing like a temp target to reduce the amount of insulin they're getting by like 10 to 30% is usually what we'll recommend as a starting point. But then again, individualizing it depending on the child. And then if you ever had a child with a fever, sometimes their basal rates double. Like they might need double the amount of insulin that they are normally getting. Because all of those stress hormones just affect them a lot more. So that's just to let you know, they could need, a 20% increase, or it could be 100%. And especially, checking ketones is important at that time, because sometimes when you have ketones, you do end up needing like double the amount of insulin that you would normally take. Again, talk to your individual diabetes providers directly, to know exactly where to go with that, because they know you better than I do. And but I'm just letting you know that there's a range. Everybody has a different range, and each illness can be different too. It's very hard to predict illness. And the other thing I do want to say, so I do research on low carb diets, not keto diets, but I do research on low carb diets in youth with diabetes. Okay. And so, so I really do feel like I want to talk a little bit about how dietary intake impacts blood sugars. And so restrictive diets or lack of food make it difficult to provide essential nutrients for growth and development. And so we try to avoid that, especially when we're young, because infants and young children, they have a super high metabolic rate. And a lot of that, it's like 3 times higher than in adults, and it's mainly the brain. So we want to make sure that that brain has everything that it needs to be able to grow and develop. And that's because it's just growing so fast, even compared to the extremities. And by the time you're 2 years old, your brain is like almost as big as it's going to be later on in life. So it's very interesting, but I know there's a lot of debate out there, and that's not the focus of this talk about like, low carbohydrate diets and stuff. But I just wanted to let you know that that's where a lot of this is coming from, is just the rapid growth and development that happens in childhood. Okay. We had a few questions. Let me see. Okay. A lot of parents debate loose versus tandem closed loop. What advice do you have? This is, yeah. So I think, so it's a very individual decision. And it's hard because I've seen lots of people be really successful with tandem closed loop, and I've seen lots of people be really successful with loop. And I think it's just, I really do think it comes down to how much you really want to be able to manage those settings yourself. So if you feel like, you know, the targets for these other pumps, like, you know, like with tandem, I think the target is like 110. If you don't like that 110 target, you want it to be a little bit lower. You can always think about trying loop, or if you want to be able to set like higher targets and have flexibility about where those targets are. That's the biggest thing that I think would change my mind. And then it just depends on how you feel about having like the loop community to help support you if you run into an issue versus, you know, being able to like call a company and have them send you like a new pump or something if something were to go wrong. So it's kind of like, you know, you have loop community support. And I think this Loop and Learn group is fantastic. So if you're comfortable with that type of support, then that's great. And then if you're more comfortable with like just having the system that's like FDA approved and things like that, then like, that's also great. I think it's a very individualized decision. I also think if you're really, you know, right now the Omnipod, closed loop hasn't been FDA approved yet. So if Omnipod's really important to you, then it works better for your child, and the tubes just, you know, aren't going to work. I've had people where tubes work great and Omnipod doesn't work. And I've had people where Omnipod works great and tubes don't work. You know, everybody's different. So just finding out, like, does tubing make a big difference in that as well, I think is important. Those are the things that just popped up in my head, but usually we have like a longer conversation and it's more individualized. Carb ratio is stronger along with basal when sick. Yeah, I definitely overrides when sick, 100%. I definitely do. I have, now if for anyone who is like using like a tandem pump, I usually make a separate profile for that, where I just adjust the basal rates and insulin to carb ratios. And I have like their sick profile versus their regular profile. So it's kind of like doing the same thing in loop, where like you can set a temporary override. You're like, you're sick, you're going to need 150% more of your usual insulin because, you know, you've just been running high all day, and we know that. And you can set that temporary override. And if they start to come down, you could always turn it off or turn it down to like 120%. Those are all things that you can do temporarily to help with that. So I definitely do recommend that. I'm worried it may be too many changes at once. You know, honestly, for the pregnancy and type 1 group. So again, I do not, as soon as someone becomes pregnant, they no longer see me, they see someone else. I feel like most people I've talked to needed like a month to kind of really get used to all the changes and like adjustments and things like that. I mean, you could even do something where if you just if you wanted to use loop during pregnancy and you were like nervous about all the changes, you could even do something where you just keep it on overnight, because that's the part of the, I mean, you're going to want to rest, right? And sometimes that overnight is where you're really seeing the most benefit. And so if you're not quite ready to do all the daytime adjustments and you're comfortable like with what you're currently doing, then you could just turn it on overnight and let you sleep. I actually kind of did that when I started. I just started with overnight, and then I added in the mealtime boluses and tweaked settings later.
Laura, can I come in really fast? This is Annette. I'm an RN CDE, and I've been through a pregnancy with loop.
Thank you.
I just wanted to share some of my experience with that as well. I actually started open APS while I was pregnant with my second son. And for me, this is my experience. I know we've had a lot of discussion in the DIY looping and pregnancy group. For me specifically, it was a lot. It was very hard for me. I was very, very comfortable with changing all of my settings through pregnancy, making those adjustments. Granted, I did it a lot with my patients as well, being a CDE, but it was a lot for me and I really struggled. I never knew if it was a loop thing or if it was a pregnancy thing. So I think I was about 6 months pregnant when I started. So I was really starting to get into a lot of insulin resistance at the time. I ended up stopping open APS at the time. I finished the pregnancy. Once he was born, I started again. Right from the get-go, the postpartum period was much easier having loop. Granted, it was open APS. Very soon after that, I switched to loop. I looped for 2 years and then I had a third baby, and that pregnancy was so much easier. I was very comfortable with loop at that point. I know in the DIY looping and pregnancy group, we see that question a lot. A lot of people do start getting pregnant. If anybody watches this or if anybody's listening and has that question or is in that debate, especially if they're not pregnant yet, I would encourage people to start loop first, kind of like what you said. And then, if you're planning the pregnancy, once you're comfortable with it, then maybe trying to get pregnant. Doesn't always happen like that. You can't always plan ahead. So if you do decide to loop while you're pregnant, kind of like what Laura said, I would just say, take it slow, maybe start at night. Really having somebody that knows loop and can help with the adjustments, I think is good, especially if it's a first pregnancy. Because I know for me, I generally was making changes to my settings on a weekly or bi-weekly basis because that's just what was required. So that's kind of what I would recommend. The benefits for a lot of people outweigh the learning curve. For me, I just felt like it was adding so many different moving parts to my diabetes. It was just much easier and much more simple without adding loop to it. So that's why I chose not to loop for that second pregnancy. But like I said, everyone's different and you just kind of have to decide for you what works best.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, of course.
That was very helpful. And yes, I've seen that with, I've talked to a lot of people who loop during pregnancy and that they're just making dose adjustments like twice a week. And they're like, why do I need so much insulin towards the end? And it's, yeah, it can be daunting, but you can do it. Okay. All right. So there was a question in here about food, and I do want to get to this, and I don't even know how long I've been talking or how long I'm supposed to be talking for, but we're just going to continue for right now. So I think nutrition plays a huge role in what happens to your blood sugars after you eat. Okay. So with our insulin to carbohydrate ratio, we're kind of looking at, it's only based on carbohydrates, right? So it doesn't include, if you have like a high protein meal, it's possible that like you may need to bolus for protein too. And sometimes I think in the chat, they said that like a lot of endos will recommend increasing the basal. If you increase the basal and you don't eat that high protein meal, you're going to go low afterwards. So I tend to be more, I tend to advocate for more like entering like a portion of that as protein. You can do 40%, I think is usually what some people do. But again, it's going to be it could be somewhere between 20 and 40% depending on you and your needs. But you may need to bolus for some of that protein as well. And the protein doesn't always cause like a rapid spike either. So it might cause a little bit more of a slow progression to increase your blood sugars later. There's a slide on this, but I just was getting ahead of myself. Okay. But in general, with most meals, we're kind of looking at your insulin to carbohydrate ratio affecting your blood sugars within 2 to 3 hours of a meal. Your insulin sensitivity factor, how it's working 3+ hours after an insulin bolus. So if you're running high after a meal, followed by a late post-meal low, that might just be that sensitivity factor was too much, okay? If you're running really high after a meal, I oftentimes will look at that insulin to carb ratio first and be like, was there enough insulin given there for the meal? Because if we had brought it down, maybe things would have smoothed out. If you tend to under bolus for your carbs or your carb plus protein intake, you're going to see that it's going to stay high afterwards. And your insulin sensitivity factor is designed to lower your blood sugars, not kind of irrespective of additional food. So it doesn't know that there's additional food in the background unless you tell it. So you could potentially split up your meal and be like, okay, I'm having 20 grams of rapid acting carb, but then I'm having, 15 grams of slower acting carbohydrate that you could use as protein, sort of entering 2 different meals at once, so that it knows that it's going to need to be much more aggressive after the first 3 hours because you're still digesting that food. Basal rates, I typically think of if you're having a pattern every day. It's a very consistent pattern. And people will do basal testing and things like that, which can be helpful, but basal testing doesn't include long acting proteins and fats, right? If you're going to eat a high protein, high fat dinner, and then you do basal testing, it might not reflect what your normal eating habits are. So, and basal testing is just where you stop eating at a certain point and you kind of fast until the next day to kind of see what your basal rates are. But it's not what you would typically do every day. So I like to look at more of what we're doing every day and what kind of patterns we're seeing. And I usually will adjust a basal rate if I'm just every day it looks like we're going high around this time and we've talked about the meals and stuff and we don't think it's one of the other two, then I'll kind of adjust the basal rate. Let's see. So we talked about insulin to carb ratios kind of affecting 2 to 3 hours within a meal. If you're going low within 2 to 3 hours of a meal, then that was probably a little bit too much insulin. For the sensitivity factor, if you sort of hover above the threshold, of whatever your target is, and it just doesn't seem to bring it down, you may need a little bit more of an aggressive insulin sensitivity factor, but also think about what you ate at that previous meal. And was it something that was going to last a longer time? And then sometimes we'll see the oscillations. So with the insulin sensitivity factor being too high, we're going to see you drop low and then you might go back up and then you drop low again. We sort of see this oscillatory pattern. And so then you might want to be less aggressive with your insulin sensitivity factor. Okay. And then basal rates, I know this is debated a lot. I mean, with closed loop, it depends on how you bolus, so there's a really wide range of what basal rates you could have when looping. I haven't had too many folks below 30% of basal as their total daily dose. And unless you're doing very, very low carb, usually it's not more than 70% in the kids that I've seen. So that's just a general kind of range. It's huge. So and so the nice thing about loop is that it does have this dynamic carbohydrate absorption feature. So as your blood sugars rise after a meal or stable or something, it's going to be able to kind of figure out based on your settings how much of those carbs got absorbed. So that's why I do kind of advocate for entering entering your protein as carbs, because if you're eating a high protein, low carb meal, because that it's going to kind of watch it over time and see how much it's raising your blood sugar. And then, it'll know to be more aggressive for that reason. Okay. All right. So this the dreaded postprandial spike. So again, insulin does not stop working instantly. Peak action occurs within 45 to 90 minutes. It wears off within 2 to 3 hours. Carbohydrate absorption depends on so many different things: glycemic index of the food and composition of the meal. And liquids with carbohydrates are going to get absorbed much more quickly and tend to raise the blood sugar more quickly. Complex carbs tend to be broken down more slowly. And foods with higher protein or higher fat content don't cause that rapid spike like we talked about, but they may cause late postprandial hyperglycemia. So 2.5 to 5 hours later for protein, and maybe like 5 to 12 hours later for fat. Food can last a long time. It can be digested very slowly. And if, sometimes with kids, if they're sick, we can see they can have like slowing of their stomach emptying into their small intestine where the food gets absorbed. So we could totally see that. We can totally see that happen. And so that's why we have to think about, if we're having a meal and we have a drop in the blood sugar followed by a high, is there something else going on? Is it like an illness that's related to this? My dog says hi, by the way, in the background. Just something, this is really important, especially for young kids and toddlers, is that, let's say they didn't finish their meal. You can go into loop and delete some of the carbohydrates that you've already entered. So that way, from that point on, it'll say, okay, those carbs weren't eaten, so I need to back off on the amount of insulin I give from here on out, or I don't need to give those automatic boluses, or I can lower the basal and like shut it down because those carbs weren't actually eaten. So I think that's a really great thing to do. And then if you need to add more carbs, you can always do that as well. Hypoglycemia. So only 4%. Oh, okay. There was a question in the group: if basal in a 3-year-old, 31 pounds, is only 4% on total daily dose on closed loop, how do I start troubleshooting or fixing the basal rates? I can't have her fast. Oh yeah, of course. That's a very individualized thing that I would kind of have to look at more closely. And it also depends on how far along they are since they were diagnosed, because if you're near the point where you were like recently diagnosed, sometimes those kids need very, very little basal at all, because they're still making some of their own. Yeah. I mean, in that time frame, you could still be. And so that would be my guess, but I'd really have to talk to you a lot more and get some more information about like diet and all sorts of things. But that can happen in the earlier period, after a diagnosis, where they're still making some of their own insulin. And so they don't end up needing very much. Yeah. And that's a good, so Marion just said, is it scheduled basal or delivered basal? Because that can be very different. It's another question. So delivered basal. Yeah. When it's really, that would be something. And I don't think that there's any, like, if the blood sugars are looking good, we're not having ketones, we're not having severe hyperglycemia, I would say we're probably not gonna, I wouldn't be as worried about it. I would just say, okay, this is just what her needs are. But yeah, scheduled basal is pretty small. But again, in the toddlers too, especially early after diagnosis, we can see them not needing very much at all. I had one of my kids on like half a unit twice a day of Lantus, and it wasn't very much at all. But carbohydrates can really impact toddlers. So like they eat a small amount of carbs and it's like whoosh, their sugars shoot right up, right? Because the amount of sugar that you eat per body weight is what raises your blood sugar. So they're having a little small amount and they have a big spike afterwards. It actually does make sense. And so sometimes, the smaller the child, we might recommend even less of a glucose treatment. And so that's kind of what I wanted to highlight here, that the younger kids may need less, but it's individualized. If your child needs 15 grams and they're a toddler, then give them 15 grams if that's what gets them up from hypoglycemia. And then usually with kids of all ages, I usually recommend suspending the insulin at 80 to help prevent hypoglycemia. So we've had hypoglycemia for a while, and now we have this post hypoglycemia spike, and we're like, I just gave the 15 grams. I don't understand. This comes up a lot, but it's like, I gave the right amount. I don't know why the blood sugars are so high. And so your body does make a lot of different hormones to try and raise your blood sugar. when you have hypoglycemia and you have type 1 diabetes. Okay. So these stress hormones are oftentimes what causes your blood sugars to go high and your inability to get it down afterwards. You keep giving insulin and it's like, why is it so high? It won't come down. That's a hormone issue. And so rather than trying to really battle that hormone issue, I try to prevent the low that caused that whole thing to happen. So a lot of times when you're using loop, some people do this. I don't typically recommend it, but like, I would not recommend inputting carbohydrates for low treatments, because then loop is going to say, hey, you ate 15 grams of carbs. As soon as that blood sugar starts coming up, it's going to want to start giving you insulin for those 15 grams of carbs that you had. And I think that then sometimes that can cause you to have another low shortly thereafter. And so just in my experience, that's usually what I recommend. Okay. And then overnight hypoglycemia. A lot of times this can be related to like the meal at bedtime, the meal, or the meal at dinner, the meal before the snack. Was it too much insulin for one of those? Or was it just the content of the meal was different? Have we been eating like fewer carbohydrates than normal during the day? And so if you're eating fewer carbohydrates, you don't have as much storage of glucose in your glycogen. Storage of glucose as glycogen in your liver. So then overnight, your same basal rates might be too much. So then you may need to decrease them for that reason. Maybe you had exercise in the late afternoon or evening, and that depleted your muscle and your liver glycogen because you were exercising. So then that's another time when your body's going to work to replete that. And then maybe you could have some low blood sugars and be more insulin sensitive. And then, so a lot of times when I look at these overnight lows, I just want to know, when was the last insulin dose given? Was it within the last 2 to 3 hours? And was that insulin dose too much? After 2 to 3 hours, I'd be looking more at insulin sensitivity or the basal rate playing a role. And then of course, there's always, if you have celiac and type 1 diabetes, you could, if you get exposed to gluten, you could have unpredictable carbohydrate absorption. And also if you've had a recent illness where you've had vomiting and diarrhea, you may not absorb carbohydrates as well as you did before. So those are some other times when we can run into issues where we're just not absorbing the carbs like we think that we're going to. And then of course, if you have an illness where you're just not eating as much overall, that's another time when you might run into some issues with some overnight lows. And you may want to just set a temporary override to lessen the amount of your insulin needs overnight by, somewhere between 10 and 30%, like we discussed. Okay. Let me see. There were some questions in here. Are they? Okay. Managing exercise and blood sugar levels in kids. This is a great question. I have a whole 60-minute talk on managing exercise and blood sugars in kids. And so the biggest thing that I think a lot of people miss, and not just like patients and things like that, but even like providers miss, because I think that we're always kind of taught like, 15 grams before you exercise and then go exercise and have fun. And that's just not how it works. So I think you need to think about how long ago was the last rapid acting insulin dose? When was the last bolus? And how much insulin is on board? And so if you have a high amount of insulin on board, like I've sort of learned what my insulin on board is, where I can start an aerobic activity and like run around. And so for your like child or toddler, you might be like, okay, every time the insulin on board is around this, when they run around, they're always going low, or like, jumping up on a trampoline, that can cause lows pretty rapidly. So I usually think of aerobic activities as being more likely to lower the blood sugar, running, jumping, swimming, all those sorts of things. And that'll lower the blood sugar more rapidly if you have more insulin on board. And then if it's been a while since your last insulin bolus, you're at least 2 to 3 hours, you're less likely to see as much of a drop when you're exercising. So sometimes in those cases, I've had kids have like a protein snack or something prior to exercise if they can. And then, and if they have more insulin on board and they're running around, then I'm going to be like, let's keep having some sugar containing snacks periodically. Looping and exercise. Okay. Recess right after lunch. Okay. Yeah. So that's great. You can, I mean, there's a couple of things you can do if there's recess right after lunch. You can lower the amount of insulin. I mean, honestly, the best thing to do is to lower the amount of insulin at the meal before, if there's going to be recess right after lunch. Just because that insulin on board is going to affect their exercise. Now, your child may be different. Maybe they get super excited during recess and they might make more adrenaline, and then their blood sugars might go up when they exercise. It is all very individual. Okay. So if you're seeing lows during exercise, we're going to want to decrease the amount of insulin that we're giving prior to exercise. And the amount that we decrease it is very individualized. And then if we see highs after exercise, then maybe we're okay. Maybe we want to increase, the insulin that we're giving, or we could set a little bit of a higher basal rate during that time as well, because we know that their insulin needs are higher during that time when they're all excited. So those would be a couple of thoughts I had on that. Okay. I just have a couple more slides. So basically, you know, when you're looping, if the current blood glucose or any predicted glucose falls below that suspend threshold, it's not going to recommend a bolus. So this can happen sometimes if your threshold is set at 80 and your blood sugar is 70 and you're eating a meal, it's going to say, I don't think you need this bolus. And so you could just enter the carbohydrates or enter the amount that you want to bolus yourself. It can give you an estimate, or it might give you a warning and say like, hey, you don't want to enter this right now. Or you can wait for your blood sugars to rise up to above the threshold and then just remember that you have to go in and give the bolus. But it will be able to calculate it for you if you just go in and just hit bolus once the blood sugar has gone above whatever your suspend threshold is. And so let's see. And so when the predicted minimum glucose rises above the suspend threshold, the bolus tool that you can initiate yourself can provide a recommended bolus. Just remember that the automatic boluses are only 40% of the calculated bolus, and those can be delivered every 5 minutes.
I would add here, Laura, because
Yes.
you have really good information here. Another thing I would add is that if your the automatic delivery of insulin, whether increased temp basal or boluses, like if you forget to go look for the bolus later, won't happen until your current blood sugar and the whole prediction are at or above your correction range. So sometimes what we'll do, if you know you want the system to take care of it, but at a lower number, we may turn on the pre-meal or a lower correction range, like override with a lower correction range for 30 to 60 minutes. Like you don't want it to be on all day. But that means when your blood sugar starts to curve back around and come up, it can start to deliver on its own at a lower number, just in case you forget to do the bolus. It's a tricky part of the correction range logic that I didn't learn until well over a year into looping. So it's a nice little trick.
That's great. I think I already do that myself, but I don't think I actually verbalize it to other people. So thank you.
Yeah. So doing the pre-meal after you enter the carbs can help. So that way it's a lower target range. So as you start to come up, loop can give insulin sooner, and then it'll expire after 60 minutes on its own if you use that pre-meal function. For those parents that are using remote overrides, you may want to make one. I did maybe 4 or 5 months ago, I made a target of 71, a correction range of 71, for example. And it just runs for 30 or 40 minutes or 60 minutes or something. And I can set it remotely. So when she's about to eat lunch, I can turn it on if I happen to catch it or think about it. And it's helpful. She has recess before lunch, so usually diving into her meal. So Loop doesn't like to recommend a whole bolus. So it's something we have to use pretty regularly.
That makes sense. Okay. Yeah, someone else said I use pre-meal override, not the pre-meal function. I set it for 2 hours, so it works before and after the meal. Great. Okay. Just a couple of things that I think is important to set with your provider is a max bolus and then a max basal rate. So when you think about your max bolus, you do want to think about what's the maximum amount of insulin that I typically give this child, any time of day, and kind of set it at a level that just to make sure that you don't end up getting too much at some point for whatever reason. And then the basal rates as well. Sometimes sending that max basal rate can also be helpful, because if it's too high, sometimes it can really, at least when you use the basal feature that you're adjusting, it can really give an awful lot. And so you may just want to discuss that. And then I don't know if other folks use auto tune. I sometimes like to just to kind of see what it's saying, see what I'm thinking, and just to get another perspective, I guess. But it is something, it's like a website that you can use where you put your Night Scout URL in there, and it will, and then you can just ask it to give you some suggestions on dose adjustments. I'd definitely be curious to hear what other people's thoughts are on that. Which branch do I use? I use automatic bolus currently, but I was using the basal rate adjustments before that. I like automatic bolus. It's been good. Okay. All right. And that concludes my talk. However, I am more than happy to answer other questions that came up or other suggestions. If people wanted to debate something, I'm open to that. I like hearing different people's perspectives because I think it helps open my mind to all the possibilities. So thank you all for your attention today. I really appreciate it.
I think Kathleen has a bunch of questions that she had pulled off earlier. So Kathleen, go for it.
Sure. So Dr. Nally, thank you so much. This was an incredible presentation with lots of really wonderful pieces of advice and background into some of the science and metabolism and the technology development. So thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. I've been posting a lot of the questions that I pulled out of the Facebook groups in the chat, and you've hit a lot of them. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the stress piece. You mentioned it sort of in the beginning. And I know you've talked about how the impact of stress can elevate blood sugars, but even just helping our children manage the stress if they've had a traumatic diagnosis. Right now, in some of the schools that I work in, even non-T1D kids are just suffering from so much stress because they're being like thrown back into these large group settings that they've been told are dangerous, and now suddenly they're okay and they don't know why. And so I think, if there are ways that our type 1 children can sort of navigate those pieces, every little bit helps. So I wonder what thoughts you have around that.
Yeah, no, I do think it's really important to help our kids manage stress as much as we can. So, I think giving them confidence in like whatever they're doing, like they're going back to school. I don't know where people are and what these like mask situations are, but just reminding them that, like you're going in, you're wearing your mask for protection, or like trying to just reassure them on the things that they are doing to try and help not get sick, I think is important. If they're vaccinated, then being like, that's helpful. I mean, it's been really effective in kids who have gotten the vaccine against like severe illness. And I think just trying to reassure them as much as you can, but also encouraging them to be like careful and mindful of things is important. But yeah, no, the stress that kids are feeling these days is just beyond, I think what they've experienced in years past. It's very hard. The only, as far as diabetes goes, I think if we're just talking like, COVID and the mask, I say just trying to give them reassurance as much as you can and having them practice safe, like mask wearing and things like that. And if it's a school where like the family's really not comfortable, then just getting your provider support to try and help come up with a plan for that child that's individualized. I've definitely worked with a lot of my patients in lots of different situations and tried to help them by like writing notes to school to advocate for them and stuff, whatever we need to do so that the family feels comfortable. With diabetes and stuff, I think I worked with Corey Hood when I was at Stanford, and I learned a lot about, treating diabetes like it's just a number and it's not a reflection on you.